All right, I think Bobby, we could probably get started.
Okay, great. Thanks, Annalisa, and thanks everyone for joining. Really looking forward to this webinar today and sharing with you some of the great work that we've been doing with Emma and the Critical Literacy Project. This is the first of what we hope to be many kinds of webinars in this domain, where Parlay will actively look for people who are leaders in the field of education of their specific disciplines, and we'll work with them to create discussion topics for the Parlay universe, and then share those discussion topics out with the community, of course, and then do webinars that that really help dive a little deeper to help understand some of the collections that we're creating and how it all weaves together into the bigger picture of what we're trying to accomplish at Parlay. So today, obviously, specifically, we're looking at teaching digital literacy through Parlay discussions. And just before we get started, I'd like to quickly introduce Emma. So Dr. Emma Pauncefort is, well, she calls herself a learning science practitioner, which is a really awesome title. And she's the founder of Delecte, which is a consultancy that has done a number of research projects, and specifically around the Critical Literacy Project, which is what we're going to learn about today. Emma has graduated Cambridge and UCL, and we met her about 2 years ago, and we started working together about 6-7 months ago on this project. And Emma has this great quote that says, "We need to nurture deep critical literacy skills in young people urgently. The ability to read between the lines, to analyze, evaluate, and form independent judgments when faced with a piece of text, not to mention the ability to recognize and unpick our own biases, is very important. It's very important. It is the root of safeguarding career paths in the rise of automation, and to promoting well-being and empathetic global citizenship as the digital world increasingly penetrates our lives." We share the same sentiment at a very, very foundational level here at Parlay. So needless to say, we were kindred spirits, and we're really excited to work together. And I'm excited to introduce Emma to you today and get her to share some of the work that she's been doing on the Critical Literacy Project, and of course, the work that we did together to create this collection. Just before we get started, a quick agenda. So we're going to do a quick introduction into the concepts, into the ideas, into what the Critical Literacy Project's all about, and then the methodology behind it, of course, constructing the roundtables, so how we decided to build them, and the sort of thought process that went into translating these research and these ideas into a series of discussion topics in a Parlay Universe collection. And then we're going to explore and do a little hands-on activity where we'll get everyone who's interested to sign up and participate in a discussion and get a feel for what the sort of flow would look like from the student perspective in a Parlay discussion. And then finally, we'll save some time at the end for Q&A, which of course, if you have questions, just feel free to drop it in the chat as the webinar and presentation goes on. And of course, a couple members of our team will be there to answer your questions as best as possible. Okay, so without further ado, I'll pass it off to Emma to introduce herself, to introduce her work, and yeah, we'll get started on the presentation. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Bobby, for that really generous introduction. And I'm so delighted to be here with all sorts of geographies. I feel like I've done a whole host of armchair travel as I've been seeing everyone's geographies pop up. And it was just making me reflect that we've become so jaded by all the screen time we've had to sort of endure over the past year. But isn't this amazing? As I think I nodded to at the beginning of the materials that I put together, and that sit behind these roundtables. So thank you so much for joining and for enduring really another Zoom call and some more screen time. But I really hope that today will be beneficial, not just in terms of excavating all of the research and evidence that's gone into these roundtables and resources, but also more broadly for your teaching practice and of course learning as well, because we're all learners throughout our lives, even once we come out of formal education systems. So in my first show, hopefully, of a bit of the technical side of digital literacy, let me share my screen and hope that this works okay. Okay. Let's see, here we go. think we are in business. So really delighted to be here, as Bobby was saying, to think a little bit more about this topic of digital literacy through the Parley discussions. And as I go through the various methods and the content that we've brought together, I really want to highlight the power really of the collection that we've put together and how that comes together with the Parley platform. So Bobby introduced me as a learning science, here we go, let's see, there we go, a learning science practitioner. And it might be that a few of you are wondering what on earth that might be. Now, if you were to go to Google Ngram and chart learning sciences, you'll see the level of incidence sort of gradually rise from the year 2000 upwards. So it's a really interesting domain. And actually my work in the education sector over the past 10 years has really started to congregate under the learning sciences. So what exactly are they? I've taken a snapshot of 4 of the areas today, and I'd like to go through these very briefly, both to give a sense of some of my background, but also some of the rich interdisciplinary research and evidence that I've really looked to bring together and sit behind some of the resources that we've co-created. So first of all, cognitive psychology, and we might nod here to Carol Dweck's work, which is much used, if a little bit misunderstood sometimes, that growth mindset work. Some really important learnings there. We also have instructional design. And of course, you've got some superb instructional design experts on the team at Parley. So really structuring our resources with the right methods to really promote learning. We then have, in addition, applied linguistics and neuroscience. And the applied linguistics here really sort of makes a nod to my background in a previous life as a literary critic and cultural historian. And then the neuroscience layered on top of this is really to make a nod here that the learning sciences are really drilling deep down into an understanding of how and why we think and the biochemical sort of makeup going on behind this, and how that really feeds into how we learn, which of course is really important given our context, and we're thinking of this 21st century context when we have to think about how we're going to cope with changing society around us and really look to thrive in society, both personally and professionally. And the intersection of these 4 areas really is where there's a sweet spot and some real interesting learnings. So Delecti is my education consultancy. It's currently run out of the sun-kissed city of Bath, beautiful 18th century Georgian city, perhaps not as sunny as some of the places that I've seen pop up in the chat, but beautiful nonetheless, so definitely worth a visit once you can. And the role of Delecti is really to promote connected and critical learning, and to provide both teachers and learners with strategies and toolkits to leverage their learning and education, both now in maybe a formal education setting, but also for the rest of their lives also. And the Critical Literacy Project really started out as an element of social activism on my part, but really grew out of my concern that we weren't really connecting up the dots between education and the skills that we really need to thrive in 21st century society. So critical literacy, what is it? Don't want to be another one of those people bringing forward a term that comes without a definition. So very broadly speaking, what I'm getting at here is critical thinking, by which I mean scaffolded thinking skills, and adding that to literacy, by which I mean, too quick to appear, by which I mean functional literacy skills, of course, as we need. Knowing how to read is really important, but I'm going beyond there. And in terms of thinking of literacy as the way we read and interpret other people's texts and ideas. So bringing that together with our scaffolded thinking skills, as with this questioning of critical thinking, and what's the outcome that we hope for It's these empowered, independent decisions. So we've gone through a process and we can be confident that what we come through to at the end is something that has been reasoned as independent as far as is humanly possible from our surroundings and other factors. And what I mean in terms of these decisions, well, once we go beyond the classroom boundary, what are the things that we need to make our decisions on? Who to vote for? Are we going to take a COVID vaccination? Something that's very topical at the moment. And a whole host of making decisions about products and services and opportunities and overcoming challenges. So I really see this critical literacy as fundamental for our current context. Of course, we've got to make reference to the global health crisis, but also beyond that as well. And I've just realised I might have been muted. Was I muted for the last few seconds?
No, you're good to go, Emma.
Perfect. Okay, because that would have been sad. Perfect. Okay, thank you very much, Annalisa, for confirming. That's excellent. Thank you. Okay, so much for the critical literacy project and the thoughts behind it. What have we got and what does it come out in with this co-creation of this flexible collection of 12 roundtables that we've brought together? Very flexible collection that can be used in the following ways. They can be used individually, they can be used in sets, and by which I mean, so the sets, you'll see that there's 5 different colours here in the roundtables. We have a yellow set, a set of 2, we have a pink set, another set of 2, a blue set, a third set, and then we have 2 sets of 3, a green set and an orange set. Now, these can be used, the roundtables, they've been crafted so they can work individually, they can work in these sets or as a series. So here, really, what we've offered up is a mini curriculum, a bit of a mini journey, a fresh look at what our digital world is, how we're involved in it, and how we can really think about how we're constructively and creatively involved in its next chapter as well. And I'll come back to that in a moment. And what's sitting behind it and how are the motivations that I've talked about, which sit behind my own consultancy and the critical literacy project. Well, the collection really promotes 2 core things. That's critical education, by which I mean questioning. That's knowing to interrogate everything which we come across, whatever the content, whatever the context. And connected education. What do I mean by connected education? Well, we tend to, in formal education settings, put subjects in silos, or at least not intentionally, but that's how, in my practice and in my experience, a lot of children and students tend to think of their subjects as sort of carved up and divided up. So here, the resources are really trying to promote working across discipline and subject boundaries, but also beyond that, thinking of making those classroom boundaries as porous as possible, those school and university boundaries also as porous as possible. So we're really connecting up what happens in our classrooms, seminar rooms, lecture halls with the everyday lived experience. And this is really coming to the heart of my research and practice, which sits under the aegis of Dilecti, including the critical literacy project. So there's 3 characteristics. The first of these characteristics that really colour the roundtables is being subject agnostic. So as I've referenced, this idea that these roundtables could be deployed in any humanities or STEM setting, information, literacy skills, research skills, study skills. They can really, they cut across all areas. The second is that we've made them 2021 relevant for digital literacy. What do I mean by that? Well, there's a lot of topical debates cutting across all different areas of what we might think of as being digital literacy. So how we navigate information, our use of social media, our use of the internet for reference resources, thinking about how our data is valuable for companies, and perhaps most importantly of all for our current context is thinking about our well-being and digital management, and especially important when we've gone through months and months of online teaching, which can be particularly hard for students, and of course it's super hard for educators and teachers also. So coming back to the individual then, this moment, this point about well-being, is that's the other really key point of these roundtables, that they start with the individual learner. And here I'm really drawing on to go back to that learning science Venn diagram, those learnings, particularly from neuroscience. So our understanding of how biochemically we have evolved to react in certain ways and become conditioned. And here I'm making a nod to the whole host of psychological biases that we now understand really control a lot of the way in which we think and the way we learn, and really intervene in the way in which we discuss ideas with other people, and really colour the way in which we discuss and the decisions we make on what we discuss. So we've really thought about how you can promote that moment of pause, moment to reflect and think about our own individual emotions, biases and feelings that might indeed come to play a part in the information we're trying to pick through in front of us. So in terms of then what this method all comes to really bring together, we have the set of 12 roundtables, and we're really coming to the core of what it means to be critical. So here I'm harking back to the idea that being critical comes from the Greek verb krino, which means judge and evaluate. So at the core, when we think about 21st century skills, and it's often the critical thinking that's put forward as one of the key 21st century so-called soft skills, what are we thinking about when we're thinking about being critical? And to come back to our current set of resources, what we're really looking to promote here is critical engagement, which is the ability to judge and evaluate, which of course is of real importance across our studies, across our learning and our personal lives as well. So critical engagement then, to summarise, being this questioning, and each of the roundtables to really promote and scaffold, we've divided them up into different levels of, or different modes, shall we say, of questioning. I'll come back to this idea of levels because I don't want to suggest there's a hierarchy in them. So, taking this critical engagement and starting with the questions, each roundtable is divided up into between 2 and 4 discussion points headed by prompts. And these prompts are headed with active verbs. And this point about active verbs is really important. What are we broadly looking to support our students with when we're thinking about their interactions and engagement with the online space? Well, to hark back to Michael Halbin's term, conceptualization of netizenship back in the 1990s, it's about becoming positive contributors. So critical literacy is really about being prosumers rather than consumers. So that real meaningful and intentional participation. And these active verbs, to think a little bit more about the lineage of this method, really comes back to Benjamin Bloom's cognitive taxonomy, with which I'm sure many of you are super familiar, first introduced in 1956, and of course since then much revised, and helpfully revised to give us this sense of a cycle. So this ongoing process, which is really important. Traditionally divided up into lower order and higher order thinking skills. Now, this isn't the place to think about the suitability of that, but I would encourage that with not really any level of thinking is equally valuable, shall we say. But just to think about where the method is drawn, the cognitive taxonomy takes us through these different modes of thinking, and traditionally takes us to this moment of create. Now, in the roundtables, between 2 and 4 discussion prompts headed by a particular verb actually revises some of the levels that even the latest revisions suggest that we undertake. So what are these prompts that we would really encourage you to share intentionally with your students? So we have reflect and connect and explain, and that is really starting to bridge this moment of individual reflection and connecting that with material in front of us, and then explaining, so thinking about those sort of conventional summary skills, shall we say. Then coming into the so-called higher order, let's say the more developed, the deeper levels of critical literacy, that questioning, that critical engagement, analysing, so breaking down into individual elements. Excuse me, there we go. Critiquing, so asking deeper questions of the material in front of us. And then finally, what's the moment, shall we say, that once you've gone through these different levels, what we get to, there we go, perfect. A very keen Google Slides on my end. We get to this moment of innovate and propose. And this is really a moment to allow your students to engage in blue sky thinking. So here, I'm really taking my cue from Tim Berners-Lee's social contract that he introduced in 2019, and really importantly highlighted the role of younger generations to shape the next chapter of the World Wide Web and the internet and digital platforms that come out of it. So there is built into the roundtables this opportunity to plug into this really exciting moment where we're thinking about the ills of the online world and how these might be rectified, challenged and re-envisioned for its next chapter. So the outcomes beyond that exciting opportunity really to think about what our digital world might come to be and how it might really enrich our daily offline lives. In terms of the roundtable discussions themselves, they're really looking to promote thoughtful and impactful debate, which of course the Parley platform already superbly achieves. But I've spent a little bit more time sort of thinking about the lineage of the method that sits behind them and the impulses, the research and evidence, and outlining the different levels, because we'd really encourage you to share this learning with your students to promote metacognition, that is knowing about knowing. And here I'm making a nod
I think I'm aware of this.
really rich research, which helps us understand how we know about what we know, and also really facilitates understanding transfer. Now, again, there's a whole area of research that challenges the idea that so-called 21st century skills learnt in isolation is a wrong thing to do, for want of a better phrase, because you can't transfer that learning. However, once put in context, and if you share explicitly and intentionally with your students the method behind, there is some really rich evidence that shows that this metacognition can then allow transfer of methods, both to other subject areas, but also if we're thinking about what the core role of education is, to really set up for 21st century society and the demands made of us. So to come back to the roundtables themselves then, we have these groups of 2s and 3s with scaffolded thinking skills. I talked about the journey. Very briefly, what is this journey? This is a journey taking this first set, this yellow set, a fresh look at what a digital world comprises. It then takes us onto a pit stop to this pink set, thinking about how we use the internet to research and find information, taking the case study of Wikipedia. It takes us to this blue set, this moment, of course, that's really relevant at the moment, of how we use the internet and online resources for our news updates. it takes us to a green set, a triplet here, thinking about social media, our interaction with it, our role, our relationship with the platforms that use our information. And finally, this orange set, this idea of really thinking about what the attention economy means for us and our digital well-being and digital management. And here, plugging into the thinking and the debates and the concerns, really, that were raised by Tristan Harris's The Social Dilemma, which was recently on Netflix, perhaps and still is. And together, what do these roundtables do? They take us on this journey of digital literacy. Say digital literacy, because it's this literacy online, not to say that these skills aren't still important offline. But importantly, I want to really underline this idea that digital literacy is much more than technical skills, which is what it's often understood as, but more these dispositions, values, attitudes.
They said I didn't need to fill out any paperwork.
Perfect. Okay, so some final notes then of what the roundtables look like and some of the content behind them, in terms of how they look rather on the platform. So in terms of the set, how do you know that they're a set? We've got the colours, but we've also got the numbers as well. So come here. So we've got 1 of 2 or 2 of 2. What's this relevance here? This indicates to you that which point are you jumping onto the scaffold, at which level of that platform are you jumping? Not to say that you need to start with the first of the set before going on to the second, but it gives you an idea of at what point you're entering. And each of them divided up, so we've got the 2 roundtables, and each of them divided up by a series of those prompts between 2 and 4, sometimes 3. So they work really well individually. They work well in a different order. And I made a reference to Tim Berners-Lee's social contract that was launched in 2019. And this actually is included in the roundtables. And if you go to, for example, the second of the yellow set, Our Digital World Today, that is a moment where you can read about the social contract, or your students rather can read about it and then discuss and debate it. So this is really to give an example of how these roundtables could be taken in any order. And that one, for example, could be taken on its own, or could be taken as the end of this sort of mini curriculum, mini journey that you go on with your students. A very brief note on the content. So Bobby alluded at the beginning in his generous introduction that I've been working on a number of projects in this field. And a lot of the videos that are linked to on YouTube in the roundtables are actually drawn from this playlist that I put together as a course of CPD, Continuing Professional Development, for the Commonwealth of Learning in Vancouver and its Europe outpost, the Commonwealth Centre for Connected Learning over in Malta. This was run back in the autumn, and there's actually a further iteration launching in a month or so's time, and you'd be super welcome to join. If you'd like more details about that, do feel free to sign up for updates on the Delecti website, or follow me on Twitter. But of relevance here, you'll notice whenever there's a numbered video that they're drawn from this playlist. And the indication, just to point out to you, that if you're interested in exploring a little bit more some of the subject and sort of follow on complementary material, you can take that straight from the playlist. So what are the outcomes? I've talked a lot about the method sitting behind. I've talked a lot about the learning sciences as a growing domain. I've also taken us back, or looked to take us back, to the very core of what it means to be critical, and trying to embed that in our teaching and our learning of how we interact and navigate the digital world. Together, in sum, what we've really looked to do with these roundtables is take that critical method and that digital literacy focused content, by which we mean more than those technical skills, those dispositions, values, attitudes, information skills, plug those into a really powerful platform that is Parlay's universe. And the hoped outcome is not sort of a completed digital literacy journey, but really setting your students up, and indeed ourselves as well, on this lifelong journey of digital literacy. So before I hand over to the Parlay team, I'd love to just hop into the universe myself and just show a little bit of some of these signposts really that I've been nodding to as I've looked to sort of help the navigation around the collection. So you can head straight to the collection through bit.ly/parlayclp. If I head there myself now, you'll see some of the ideas that I've discussed in the summary information in the introduction. And to head into one of them, for example, take the second of this material, this set on using the internet for reference. And you'll note here that there's a number, so it's from the playlist. And if we head down, you'll see that we've got different verb prompts. Here we've got 3, we've got explain, analyze, we have critique. So this is to flag, going back to the method that sits behind, that we've gone through different parts of the scaffold and we've moved on from individual reflection to breaking down what's in front of us, thinking about in this context what Wikipedia is and how we can use it through this complementary video. And the benefit of having in mind the method is that you can use the verb prompts to suggest to your students further discussion questions, or even better, to really get that metacognitive learning in process, encourage your students to come up with prompts and discussion ideas themselves. So that can be another way of extending the discussion and using these resources as flexibly as you'd like. At which point, I'm going to come back and speaking about putting the resources in action. And I'd love to hand over now to the Parlay team so we can try that. And of course, I'll be around at the end for any further questions or queries. Thank you so much.
Wonderful. All right. Thank you everyone so far for sticking around. We have now an opportunity to actually try one of these discussions in action and put ourselves in the shoes of our students as they would be going through a discussion like this. So we're actually going to use one of these discussions and try it out. We're going to use the "What are your news sources?" discussion. So of course, we don't necessarily need to take the time to watch this video today, but just so you can get a sense of what the students are going through, there's just 2 questions here, and we're getting students to reflect on the news, where'd you hear about the resources, and then of course, during the COVID-19 pandemic, where did you get your updates? So I've split the group into 2. So if you could please click the link, depending on which month you were born. I'm going to put this link in the chat so everyone can click in and join the respective discussion for this practice round. So if you were born from January to June, click the first invite link. And then if you were born from July to December, click the second one. We've just divided the group into 2 because typically Parlay Online Roundtable works best with anywhere from 15 to kind of 35, 40 students. And because we have a big group today, we'll have you go into 2 separate groups. So please click the link that I put in the chat, one of those links. And this is going to bring you right onto the student screen of what they will see when they first click that invite link. Of course, you would go through the resources on the left-hand side of your screen, and then on the right-hand side of your screen, you would see the area where you could actually submit your response. All right, so I'm going to keep the teacher view open on my screen. If Parlay is new to anyone, you could flip back and forth to the Zoom screen, see what it looks like from the teacher view. And then if you click that link, you're going to be in on the student view. So you could take a few minutes now to reflect on those 2 questions. First, the reflect question. Well, they're both reflection questions, actually. We've kept anonymity on for this discussion, so you're going to get a secret identity from someone from history. No one in the group will know who you are, except for, of course, me as the teacher. So usually when we're encouraging students to go through this, we might encourage them to number their answers, or maybe if you'd like them to answer in a paragraph response, you can have them do that as well. So for this discussion, I might say, okay, don't forget to number your responses, or just make sure you're addressing both of the questions in your entire response. And then once you're ready, you can go ahead and submit. So I could see in group one, there's a few people who have begun to submit their responses, as well as in group two. So once you're ready, there's no rush, you can go ahead and submit. And you could actually start to read through the responses of other people in your discussion. So I know there's a few others who have just joined. I'll put the links in the chat for people who want to join in, group one and group two. For anyone who's joined late, we will certainly send out the recording of this webinar once we're done. We'll also send along the resources, the links to the universe and some of the embedded resources as well. So once you're done submitting your response, you can actually navigate through the roundtable by clicking the names on the left-hand side of your screen. So once you click one of those names, it's going to bring you directly to that person's post. And you can see those guiding questions below to kind of prompt thinking on how you can leave a response. So do you agree with this person? Could you build on what they've already mentioned? Or how is their submission similar or different to your opinion? Perhaps they've even mentioned a news source you've never seen before. Usually when teachers run these sorts of discussions with their students, they'll give them a expectation of how many comments they should leave. So some teachers might say, okay, please go comment on one person you agree with, maybe one person where you learned something new, and go comment on one person to build on their idea. Or another way you could structure it is, okay, go respond to one person's post, but then go be the second commenter, join in on a thread as well. So there's different ways that you could kind of encourage students to participate. As a teacher, of course, I can go in and model certain submissions as well and star them. So I'll do that. I'll do that right here. I'm going to click star and add a model submission for each of the roundtables, and all of you will receive that notification that one post has been marked as a model submission. You can click it if you get that notification, and it'll bring you directly to that post. So maybe I really like the way that someone has structured it. Maybe there's a really interesting note that a really interesting idea that's been brought up. Or maybe this is a topic we're going to be going into tomorrow in tomorrow's class. So we could kind of highlight it here for students. The teacher can always suggest or select why it is a model submission. So when I go and click star next to anyone's post, then I will be able to say, oh, I really like this post because, you know, it was structured in the exact way that I laid out that it was expected to be. Or maybe I modeled it because I really liked the different opinion that was brought up, or the different perspective that's really unique. So you as a teacher always have the option to do that. I'll show you how to do that actually. So let's say I want to go and highlight Yokoyama Taiken's idea here. So if I click model, then it'll say, okay, well, what makes this a model submission or a conversation? So I might say, this post was structured well, and I could highlight that in, but of course you can add in anything that you'd like there. And as everyone's going through this online roundtable, of course, you always have access to click the summary and see information about how this discussion has been going at the class level. So we could see 69% of the group submitted a response, 27% gave at least one comment, and 31% received at least one comment. So this is really interesting to bring up partway through the class, especially if it's being run synchronously. So you could kind of encourage students to go and make sure everybody gets at least one comment on their ideas. Our word cloud here is quite interesting. Obviously, the word news is the most commonly used. We see news, information, media, website, resources. And we could see these back and forth discussions that are going on as well. So we could see for each student, where are students responding to each other and which students are leaving the most comments in the discussion. All right, we'll spend a few more minutes in this online roundtable discussion, and then maybe we'll go back to any questions that came up during the session. I know there were some questions in the chat, and we'll be able to address some of those in a couple minutes. All right, and I know there was one question there about assessment for anybody who might not be as familiar with the online roundtable. I can briefly show you how the assessment functions work before we get to our Q&A. So as a teacher, I can decide any criteria that I'd like when it comes to assessment. So I'm probably going to choose a 4-point scale. That's the one that I typically use, level 1, 2, 3, 4, and I can enter that here. And then I'm going to choose the criteria below. We give you a list of suggested criteria, kind of general kind of skills that typically come up when assessing discussions, but you always have the opportunity to add in your own assessment point. Maybe it's a specific standard or a curriculum expectation that you're looking for. You can make your own basically rubric points here. Now, okay, let's say I'm looking for use of evidence. Maybe for this discussion, I'm only going to look for use of evidence, and that's going to be the main piece that I am assessing. I save those changes at the top of my roundtable up here, similar to where I have anonymity and peer feedback questions. And when I go down to actually see a particular response, let's say I want to assess Annie Besant. If I click assessment, then now I have this option to assign points on a 4-point scale based on evidence. I can give her written feedback. I could see Parlay suggesting some feedback to me, or I also have a feedback comment bank that I could pull from as well. I could send her that feedback. And then I can also see all of the comments that she's made in this discussion. So up here is her original idea. And then below, we see the actual comments that she's been replying to her peers. And so that's for each individual student. And all of that information and assessment data is again available in the data export. So you can always export the class-wide data. You're going to get some of that automated data, as well as the assessment points that you've done manually, as well as the feedback, the written feedback you've given. That's always available in for export as a Google Sheet or a CSV file as well. The feedback that you give to students, the written feedback is emailed to them right away, and they also get a notification when they're on Parlay. So some teachers say, okay, you're gonna have to, everybody go back at the beginning of class and check the feedback from yesterday's discussion. That's a common practice, or you could remind them, you should have received an email. Someone just asked, how might we handle it if students get into disagreements or misunderstandings? So there's a few ways that you can kind of encourage that. One, of course, if any comments are made that are inappropriate, or you kind of want to restrict who sees those comments, either posts or comments, you as a teacher can always hide a submission. So you can click hide submission, and this is going to basically make it invisible for all of the students in the class, except for that one student who's written it. We also encourage if a student writes something in their original post and you want to give them that feedback, you can encourage them to go and edit it, maybe, you know, change up a bit of the language or explain a little bit further so that it's a little easier to avoid those misunderstandings. But ultimately, I think if a situation does come up where there's lots of back and forth, it's a really great learning moment to either highlight and maybe talk about and bring up those questions as a group when you're doing a little reflection. So is there value in, you know, how could we actually clear up those misunderstandings that happen in the class? And maybe there's other ways other than writing our ideas to actually get past those misunderstandings, because we know some things could be misunderstood in written form. All right, and then just last thing before we get to our questions, somebody did ask about editing posts. What happens when a student edits their idea? How can you actually see? So I'm going to pull up an example here. Ernest Hemingway has actually edited his idea, and when I go to his post, I could see that there's a little edited button and it says V2 in brackets. So that means there's 2 versions. So he originally submitted version 1. And that's what it looked like. And then when he went and edited his idea, now I could see version 2. So maybe he went and added a little more substance, maybe just, fixed a typo or something like that. We could see both of those versions, and students can see that as well. Alrighty, at this point, I think we could probably begin to take some questions. Maybe we'll start with anyone who would like to unmute and share their question. And then from there, we can go to the chat. Would anybody like to unmute and share their questions?
I have a question.
Sure.
Eleanor here. I'm from just down the road from where Emma is, actually. I'm here in Bath in the UK. If you were trying to get students to use the roundtables across a slightly longer term assessment, so let's say you wanted them to have a kind of reflective learning journal or something like that, and you wanted to build that in, what kind of suggestions would you have for doing that? So I guess my question is actually quite a functional one. Where do the responses become visible to the students? So when they submit, do they have their own account where they could reflect, say, on a number of the different roundtables and then maybe write a reflective piece in response as an additional assessment?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll start, and then if Emma or any of my colleagues would like to jump in to add, then we can go from there. On the student view, all of you will have seen, if you joined your roundtable, the student view is always able to see all of the discussions that you've taken part in that course. So it's actually quite easy to navigate and go through, okay, this is the first discussion we had about social media, and this is the second one, and this is the third. And then maybe the teacher would want to create a reflection piece, like an ending piece. That's actually a great idea, and maybe we'd like to use that idea and maybe add it to the collection for anybody who'd like to kind of cap off the learning journey with a reflection like that. So yes, definitely, it's quite easy for a student to be in a reflection discussion and then go in and see how they've responded to the other ones.
Thank you.
I'll jump in if I may, Annalisa.
Sure.
Thanks. So I think what you highlight is, thankfully, or excavate for us, is that the roundtables are really helpful and that they can be used iteratively. So whereas with a lot of content and resources, you might go in and use them once, and then a student might come back to them as a sort of refresher. I think given the content and our context, the collection is one which would be worth coming back to repeatedly, even if it's on an individual basis, for the student to look back at what they put 6 months ago, or indeed for teachers as well, for all of us to sort of reflect back and think about how our use and engagement with different digital tools has shifted. So I think, yeah, thank you. You make a really important point, that it's important not to see them as static responses and discussions, that you keep returning both to what you've discussed and what other people have discussed, and then linking it back up with however the societal debates have then moved on in terms of regulation or content moderation or these other, or antitrust legislation, for example. So there is an opportunity there that they're sort of dynamic rather than static.
Great, thank you.
All right, we'll take one of the questions from the chat. I know there were some questions around the age recommendations for both this collection and Parlay. In Parlay in general, we see the lowest age group is around grade 3, grade 4, so students who are around 8, 9, 10 years old. As long as they're able to obviously write their ideas, then the online roundtable and the live roundtable are both kind of appropriate. This collection specifically has been targeted for kind of middle and high school. That's not to say that it would not be appropriate for grade 4 and 5 as well. I think with slight tweaks to the questions, or maybe removing some of the resources just to simplify it a little bit, then some of these are actually quite appropriate for the younger grade level. Yeah.
And to jump in again, if I may, so I think simply, whilst you can sort of pare them down, or even, as one of the questions suggested, sort of co-creation with students, of giving them the topic and thinking of maybe their own prompts, having maybe scaffolded it with some of the thinking skills and some of the suggestions, so you could scaffold in a bit of content generation there. So that could be done for earlier years, but similarly, I think for the upper years, you could deploy these in a college, university setting by encouraging maybe more complex discussion points to be suggested. And also, I suppose, then you would expect that the discussions on a different level, given the exposure and the daily lived experience of your students. And I think the point that Annalisa makes about sort of earlier years and thinking about some of the topical debates, we know from research and policy suggestions that the earlier the possible, it's really important. And thinking here in the UK, a 2018 report that identified that primary schools, those early K-12 kids, didn't have a sense of what fake news was or some of the challenges online, and yet they're going online quite regularly and have access to devices, certainly in certain geographies. So absolutely important to introduce early, and so there's flexibility sort of built in there too.
Wonderful. All right. Does anybody else, I think we got to almost all of the questions in the chat. Did anybody else want to share a question?
Is there a way for the teacher to see who is the anonymous, that the anonymous names go with?
Yes, great question. So I will quickly share my screen here again. So when I'm in a discussion as a teacher, I can always see who's who. If you're looking at my screen now, you could see all of my secret identities. So Anne Frank and Afua Sutherland and Plato, Yazoo Nadi, Kawabata. And I could always click the eye icon. I'll zoom in on it a little bit here. If I click the eye icon, this is going to turn off the names just for me as a teacher, so I could see who's who. So I could see the real names that were in the discussion. So teacher always knows who's who. And then in addition to that, you could always turn off anonymity. If you wanted your class to be able to use their real names, you could always do that as well. And then a couple other questions. Preferred web browser. Parley is going to work best on Chrome. If you have Google Chrome, that would be preferred. But if you're having some trouble, whatever it is, you could always come down to the chat bubble and we'll be able to assist you in troubleshooting any sort of question that you might have or something that might not be showing up. Amanda had a question, will there be an administrative dashboard to view data collected? So yes, our team is actually working on an administrative dashboard right now. This would allow you to see all of the discussions that have taken place across the school, and that would of course only be available to certain admin at the school.
Can you answer a quick question about the Parley universe and how those plans are developed? And if you recommend, tweaking them in some way, or are they developed by the team?
Yeah, good question. So the Parley universe is a mix of content and discussion topics that have been created by the Parley team, as well as teachers in the Parley community. So if you go to any of the topics here, you could always click into one. Let's say we go look at Amanda Cardena's portfolio. If I click her name, then I could see all of the topics that she's made. Now, the Parley team periodically goes through and actually reviews the content here to either, make some slight changes, make sure that the resources are appropriate, and also And also just check the line of questioning as well. We have a resource on our homepage that you might be interested in checking out. And this is kind of outlining our framework and process for developing discussion prompts. So if you go down to our framework for creating discussion prompts, this actually outlines our own process internally of when we are creating content. So where we're getting sources from and how we're approaching those discussions, whether they're kind of content focused or skills focused, what are the open resources that we're looking for, the types of questions, and of course, the incorporating the style of questions as well. So those are the ones that have been created by our team. And then you'll see that when they've been certified, they have that little badge on there. That means that someone from the Parlay team has gone in and edited them.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Annalisa, may I pick up on some of the questions in the chat?
Sure.
So there was one early on about cultural sort of settings and a bit of sharing in terms of the original context of the content, the numbered videos. The course it was developed for, the Commonwealth of Learning, their remit is to empower educators across, well, everywhere, but particularly within the Commonwealth and particularly low to middle income countries. And we had, on the first iteration, we had 1,800 teachers. To show you the scope, from Afghanistan to Zimbabwe, we had a lot of Indian teachers from India, we had teachers from Fiji, Vanuatu, Peru. And what was really interesting was that their reaction to the content was very similar in terms of shared experiences and challenges. So it's something that's really important, and I'm super conscious of, given the number one, it being Anglo-centric, and also a lot of the case studies are Western case studies. But the next iteration of the content is going to be complemented by co-created resources with colleagues in Samoa, Sri Lanka, and India to really expand upon the perspectives, which I think is a really important point. There was also a question about sign-in and that not being possible for certain districts. And well, the resources, you don't need to necessarily, Annalisa, correct me here, but you don't necessarily need to sign in and use the platform to sort of map and chart the discussion. So you could, without that sign-in, you could still use them as a prompt. And I believe there's plans afoot to have the resources up as a print-off resource as well, so you can share, so that they do function separately from the platform, or they can.
Yep. That's absolutely right. Yeah, everything in the universe is completely open. You could use these resources without signing into Parlay, and you could even, take these examples and use them in your own way in your classes. You don't necessarily need to use the online roundtable to facilitate these discussions.
Can I jump in really quickly? Could you explain the
Sure.
significance of the numbers in the bottom right corner? So there's like a little, 1 and 0.
Yes. Yes, so these are actually the amount of times that this discussion has been replicated or used. So for example, if we go into the critical literacy project collection, then we could see that the one about is TikTok free, that's been run in 27 different classes.
Thank you.
And that number will be similar to when you're in the roundtable. It says use this topic, and it says 27.
Aileen, if I may pick up on your question about agency, I think that's and forgive me if I pronounced your name incorrectly. You make a really important point about what happens after you've had these discussions. What impact do these discussions have? And I think having a plan of action post, so what do these mean? Okay, we've had this discussion. For example, can you guess your screen time? You've done some reflection, you've thought about your screen time. It's like a theory of change, isn't it? What are you going to change? Given you've now reflected and thought about it, and you've heard from your classmates on what their screen time is, and you've thought about what that might mean, what are you going to do to affect change? And to go back to Eleanor's earlier question, that could be a moment whereby you use a roundtable in one class or in one session, synchronously or asynchronously, and then you could come back a week later or 2 weeks later or a month later and say, okay, you tried it, you made these discoveries and you went through that cycle. Now is that point, and that really nicely shows how that's a continuing thinking cycle going back to that revision of the cognitive taxonomy. Okay, now reflect again, come back and think, how has that changed? What's the positive impact? How's that been better for your well-being and your schoolwork and maybe your family and friends interaction? So I think you make a really important point that it's important not to let the discussions and the learning sit in the universe or sit in the classroom, but the wrap up being connecting that with what actually happens once you end the Zoom call or end the school bell rings. So thank you for that question.
Thank you for the response. That was very good. I was taking notes. And I love what you said about the cycle, because I think that actually mirrors our own cycle as professionals. We engage in a cycle of reflection and learning and assessing ourselves. And so thank you.
Absolutely. Just to really quickly respond, and that cycle and that method sits behind the whole course of the Digital Literacy Lab for Educators that the content was originally conceived for. So I think what's really interesting is that the method that we use as adults is just equally applicable to our students. And then you raise the question of being co-learners and co-creators of knowledge once you've turned that information into knowledge in the classroom.
Definitely. That's wonderful. Thanks for sharing that. All right, I think that brings us to the end of our questions. Again, we will be sharing these resources out via email afterwards. So you'll get a link to the slides, as well as a link to the collection in the universe and the webinar recording. So if you'd like to share that with any of your colleagues, then you could do that as well. Again, thank you everyone for taking the time to join and sticking around. I know we're quite a bit over time, but we appreciate you joining the session today. And again, we're here to help. If anybody has questions later on, you could always find us in the chat bubble, or Emma's contact information is on the slides as well. Thank you.